Welcome to our interview series with women human rights defenders. Today we speak with Zohra Moosa, feminist activist and executive director of Mama Cash, International Women's Fund based in Netherlands. It provides grants and non-financial support to grassroots social justice and human rights groups led by women, girls, and transgender people. Prior to joining Mama Cash, Zohra was women's rights advisor at Action Aid in the UK. Zohra, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Zohra, the mission of Mama Cash is to support women's, girls, trans, and intersex people's initiatives with funding and networks. Can you tell us why it is important to look at access to resources through the gender lens?
Sure, thanks for the question. There are many reasons why it's important that funders bring what we call a kind of gender lens to supporting activist work and the work of women human rights defenders. The first, to start off, is that gender influences every aspect of our lives. It affects our access to safety at home and in the streets, our access to education, to decent employment, to healthy environments, to having the space to speak freely and live our lives fully. So it's not really an option for funders not to take gender into account when it affects so much of our daily living and therefore our human rights work. The second reason to take in a gender lens is that we know that feminist activism actually works to advance human rights and social change. Mama Cash did a study last year where we looked at all the evidence that exists around what works to advance women's human rights and found that there's one common element in every single study that we looked at, and that is that feminist movements, the existence and the presence of autonomous feminist movements is what makes the difference. They matter a lot to whether something happens to advance women's human rights or not. Another thing maybe I would bring in to think about is that it's not just about gender. At Mama Cash, we also take what we call an intersectional lens. And this means that we pay attention to other forms of exclusion like racism, ableism, homo-antagonism, trans-antagonism, and the ways that these exclusions interact with each other. We do this because these other forms of exclusion influence how gender exclusion manifests in our day-to-day lives. So, for example, the experiences of a straight woman are not the same as those of a lesbian woman, and so on, right? So we take account of that. The final and quite important reason to take a gender lens when we're thinking about funding is that if we don't pay attention to it, we miss just how under-resourced this area actually is. We know that women human rights matter. We hear a lot about that from people. Fewer people know that feminist movements matter to making sure women's human rights are advanced. And even fewer people know that actually those feminist movements, the women's rights organizations, the organizations led by women, actually receive much, much less funding than any other human rights area. And if we don't pay attention to that, we miss then being able to support one of the key drivers of change on women's human rights.
Thank you so much for this answer. And given the fact that the topic of funding is so much connected to the topic of power, how, in your opinion, can funders make sure that they do not replicate their power dynamics that their grantees fight against in their funding work?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's always a good question to think about power when you're thinking about women's human rights, feminism. It's a key area of inquiry always. And it's true, funders decide who gets money and other resources, and that gives us a lot of power. And there are always power imbalances between the funder and the grantee partner. It's not helpful to pretend that that's not true. As funders, we need to acknowledge that and take whatever steps we can to even out the power dynamics, to transform those power relations to the extent that is possible and necessary. One of the ways that Mama Cash tries to address power issues and unequal power dynamics is providing unrestricted funding. So we provide grants where partners can decide themselves how they want to use the money, and they can use it in whatever ways that they find important. If they want to spend money on salaries, rent, computers, health benefits, advocacy campaigns, that's all up to them. By letting our partners decide how to spend the grant, and even to change the decision, through the course of the grant, switch to something else that they hadn't planned for, we try to recognize them as the ones who know best how to use those resources and to not impose our ideas, perspectives, agendas onto their work. A second way that we try to attend to the power dynamic and compensate for it where we can is to also commit to longer term relationships, generally up to 10 years. And we try to give multi-year grants wherever possible. This reduces the fundraising burden on partners, and it allows them to plan their work and look towards having a longer term vision. It allows them flexibility and possibilities in a different way. They literally spend less time fundraising and worrying about fundraising, worrying about pleasing us, worrying about telling us the things they think we want to hear so that they can secure further funding. We commit to upfront how the funding relationship is going to work so that they can spend more time pursuing their social change activities.
Thank you. And maybe as a follow-up question, as a funder based in the global north, how does Mama Cash work towards decolonization of funding?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can build on my previous answer a bit there, because this question is also about how we address power relations. Not only do funders have the money, but very often funders are based in the global north and then supporting work and activism in other areas, global south, global east. One way that some funders are beginning to address this is to sort of involve partners from global south and global east and so on in the decisions themselves about who receives funding. This approach is called participatory grant making, as the jargon goes. And this means that the people who are requesting the funding, the social movement activists, the women human rights defenders, are the ones who actually make the decisions about where the funding goes. As of this year, Mama Cash is now making all of our grants decision using this model, using a participatory grant making model. It's a pretty big change for us, and it's a very significant one as well. Mama Cash has always consulted activists about the design of our programs, and in the beginning we were created by activists, so activists were making the decisions, and we have activist advisors from all regions of the world acting in different movements that provide us with input and feedback about our work and about the grants. But for the last few decades, our staff members have been the ones making the final decisions about which groups get funding. And this year we changed that. From now on, all new grants are going to be decided on not by staff, but by activists and women human rights defenders themselves. And we're also asking applicants to our funding programs to provide input on the priorities and themes that they find most important. And this is one very concrete way we're working to decolonize funding and put decision making in the hands of the folks that are supposed to be benefiting from it.
Thank you so much for sharing this. And besides funding, which is clearly crucial to maintain work of women human rights defenders, I wonder what kind of non-financial support is, in your opinion, most effective for women human rights defenders, and how, in your opinion, does it vary from region to region?
It's a really good point that you make, because non-financial support is crucial for the work of women human rights defenders. Funding alone is not enough. It's vital, it's important, but it's insufficient. So Mama Cash provides non-financial support through what we call accompaniment. We accompany our grantee partners with non-financial support. This support can include access to networks, access to other donors, opportunities to connect with each other, things like this. A few years ago, we conducted a study with women human rights defenders and feminist activists about their experiences of doing their feminist activism, of pursuing social justice and human rights. Most of the activists we interviewed had experienced heightened levels of state-sponsored gender-based violence, harassment, intimidation, discrimination, in addition to the backlash and resistance they were already facing in their communities. The findings show that the increase in antagonism and violence, together with their heavy workloads and their commitment to maintain their resistance and to maintain their organizations, was putting a severe strain on them. You can read more about these findings in the report we published called Standing Firm. The important thing I want to share is that what we learned in this process was that feminist activists need both of these kinds of resources, both financial and non-financial, to be able to address their specific individual and collective needs for mental, emotional, spiritual, and of course, physical security and well-being. And this includes things we are more knowledgeable about. This includes things we are more knowledgeable about, like physical security, digital security, but it also covers these other aspects. These needs are urgent. And what we see over and over again is that the resources available to meet these needs in the current funding landscape are very limited. We also learned that there are regional or even sub-regional specificities to these experiences and needs. But in general, the trends transcend geographic borders. So, for example, most of the activists talked about pressures on their mental health, the need for strengthened digital security. But what forms these took was more context specific and depended a lot on the people involved in their particular situations. We held a convening with the activists involved in this research, and they gained a huge amount of support from each other, precisely because they were able to learn that their experiences, while particular, context-specific, were not unique in terms of the general trend, that there were other women human rights defenders like them in totally different countries, contexts, continents, who were facing similar challenges. And the benefit that they derived from this was this non-financial support of being able to be convened together, to talk with each other, to meet each other, and actually having the space to reflect and think together and strategize about ways to cope with this.
Thank you very much. And I also wonder, what do you think women human rights defenders working in human rights organizations across the globe, they face repression, as you said, from the state, but beside this, they might also face discrimination at work within the organizations that they work for. So what, in your opinion, can or should funders do to prevent this from happening?
Mm-hmm. It's true that women human rights defenders do face repression, not only from the state, but also at work, in their contexts. Human rights organizations exist within the same world, right? That we're all living in, and that is a sexist world. And so these organizations may be staffed with people who are invested in male privilege, for example, in patriarchy, and who are benefiting from the system as it exists now in some way. That can be a very painful thing for women human rights defenders when you expect your colleagues, for example, to have your back and then discover that they don't always. I think that funders can certainly pay attention to who the decision makers are in an organization and how power and decision making is distributed. For instance, if an organization has only men or only white people or only straight people or whatever it is in senior decision making roles, we can ask questions about that. I think it's important to sort of realize who's actually leading and making the major decisions for any organization. At Mama Cash, what we do is try to put an emphasis on self-leadership. You may have heard it described as nothing about us without us, which comes from the disability liberation movement. And the idea behind that is that organizations that are working to advance social justice should be led by the people who benefit from the thing that those organizations are working on. So Mama Cash supports grantee partners that are led by the people on whose behalf they're working. And that can help address things like this. So for example, if the organization is working on migrant women's rights, it's led by migrant women. It's not led by other people working on migrant women's behalf. Just as we talked about decolonizing funding decisions, we can also talk about decolonizing more generally. It's necessary work, and it's work that we all need to be engaged in, without exception.
Thank you very much for these words. And last but not least, what maybe a personal story or a message or a lesson learned would you like to share with other women human rights defenders out there?
I really appreciate so much the opportunity to work collectively with others who share my values and my ideas and vision for the future. And I'm constantly reminded about the power of a dedicated group of people working together, what we can achieve. We've invented the systems that we are in right now. There's nothing inevitable about them. They're social constructions. They're just things that we've created. So we can make the decision fresh every day. Every morning we can decide again to work together to remake our worlds so that they are more just and more joyous for all of us.
Thank you so much for these words, and thank you for all the insights that you shared with us. And of course, for your great work and supporting women human rights defenders. And thank you for watching us, and see you in the next interview.